Good afternoon, everyone. And Mahesh, thank you for the opportunity. And it's good to see so many of you joined online. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. Looks like you're all muted yourself, which is good. And if you want to turn your video on, please do. It will be good to see your face as well, if you can. No pressure. And if you have a question, please unmute yourself and stop me through the presentation. I like this to be a little bit more interactive. And feel free to ask any questions, or you can stop me halfway through or whatever. I'm more than happy to answer your questions. The main intention of this webinar, as I spoke to Mahesh before, is to provide some knowledge around sustainability and especially diving into zero carbon supply chain, and also answer some of your questions, if you have any, regarding what it's actually mean to be a supply chain manager, how it all works. To an extent I can explain, and also what are the possibilities of in the industry for you all in the future, and also Australia, New Zealand, and any other countries. So I'll try to answer as much as possible. So before I forget, I'm just going to share my LinkedIn profile as well on chat box. I just shared my profile on LinkedIn. So if you were keen, please connect with me, and you can also ask me or reach out to me if you need any help or assistance. I'm more than happy to help you, but expect some delays in my response. So that's me. My name is Rakesh Bandipalli, and I am the supply chain manager, like Mahesh mentioned, for a company called Lamazoko. It's a coffee machine company, and I'm also a president for Supply Chain Association in Australia. It's called SCLAA, where it's a voluntary organization, and I do a lead Victoria and Tasmanian state president role, and we do organize quite a lot of events and also connect industry professionals together. And also part of SCLAA, I do some work with the mentoring committee as well. So that's a very quick intro about myself. I'm just going to share my presentation quickly, and bear with me for 2 minutes. Share presentation mode. Yeah, okay, perfect. So can you all see the slides now?
Yes.
Oh yeah, perfect, thank you. Like I mentioned before, I'm the president for Supply Chain Association, Supply Chain and Logistics Association of Australia. It's called, in short, it's called SCLAA. And I'm also a supply chain manager for a company called Lamazoko. This is the company symbol. And I'll talk about a little bit more in detail around what I do in the business. Just a very high overview of the company. The company is founded in 1927. It's specialized in producing handcrafted professional and domestic coffee machines geared towards excellence. The headquarters is in Florence in Italy, in a beautiful Tuscany region. And it has more than 200 staff in the factory. And globally, I think the company is 500 plus employees full-time. And the machines are exported over 200 countries. We do have quite a small market in Malaysia. We do have a bit of a market in Singapore. I do help my Singapore colleagues every now and then when they need some machines. And it's good. I'm not sure if you've seen any of these machines before, but next time when you go around to a coffee shop, look out for this logo. You might find a couple of machines. Before I jump any further, Mahesh, would you mind sharing a quick video of the company? I'll stop sharing now, which will give a really good overview of what the company does. And then after the video, I'll take over again. So thanks, Mahesh.
Let us tell you a story, a 90-year journey in the manufacture of fine espresso machines. It doesn't matter if coffee is our job, our pleasure, or just a moment of personal delight. It's time to look forward and imagine a future that we wish to create. A new chapter that we can write together. Our company bases its strength on its heritage to tackle the new daily challenges. We are explorers of blue oceans, craftsmen who mould metal with skill and care. We are meticulous technicians and designers with love for aesthetics. We are the brutal force of steam and the effervescent gentleness of streaming water. We are the rush hour of a crowded coffee shop and the smoothness of the last coffee drop in a cup. We look for the perfect balance between tradition and revolution, talent and flair. Sustainability, innovation and imagination are our travel companions. We are one living creature that breathes in time with nature. We are thousands of coffee lovers around the world. It is time to envision new horizons and new adventures. We are ready. Our future is here.
Thanks, Mahesh. Hope you all enjoyed the video. Any questions from that, or anything you want to ask in particular about that video, or no? I'll just continue with my presentation. Cool. Can you all see my screen, or yes?
Yes, we can see. Rakesh, we can see.
Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, that's a quick overview of the business. As you've seen, it's a nice, good video, sort of highlights everything, what we do in the company, in the factory as well. And I had the opportunity to fly to Italy a few times before the pandemic. So it was very good. Really good to see the handcrafting machines, and the company, definitely the USP, the unique selling proposition is they're all handmade in Italy. So that's about Lamazocco, and here we are today to talk about zero carbon. Not sure how many of you are aware of the carbon emission issue within the planet. If you're following the news, you probably have seen there's quite a lot happening in Europe. And there's some countries actually burning because the heat on the planet is rising as we speak every day, and it's causing a real threat to human life. It happened a couple of months ago in US, a few months before in Australia. There's a lot of bushfires, and I'm sure Mahesh has seen a few bushfires while she was here in Melbourne. And now it's happening all over Europe, including even in Turkey as well. So it's pretty unfortunate we are experiencing all this, and to an extent, I believe even pandemic is part of the way we treat our planet. And one of the biggest reasons the global warming and the climate change is happening is because of the amount of carbon emissions, which has been a really hot topic in the industry. And it will continue to be a very important topic over the next few decades until we get this under control. So I'd like to talk about three main things in this presentation. So if you want to make a note, it's good to make a note now. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what is carbon emissions. I'm going to talk about what actually it means, how does it affect our environment, and what is supply chain has to do with carbon emissions. The second thing I'm going to talk about is what is Lamazoko doing to reduce the carbon emissions. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is how do we make these businesses better in future from extraction to the regeneration economy. So I'll repeat those three things again. I'm going to talk about different scopes of carbon emissions. Number two, Lamazoko's paths to decarbonize, which means essentially reducing the carbon emissions. And number three is how do we move from extraction to regeneration economy. So I hope that's all clear. I'll move to my next slide. Okay, so as you can see here, this is world's carbon problem, and the CO2 emissions has risen from close to 5 billion. Now we are almost reaching 40 billion in the next couple of years. That's an incredible amount of increase in the amount of carbon emissions to the planet. That's a staggering growth. And another important factor to consider here is in this little table here, is in 1950, the population is around 2.5 billion. In 2019, it's 7.7, and we're touching close to 8 billion in a couple of years. So the per capita CO2 emissions is around 4.72. While the CO2 emissions comes from a variety of natural resources like forestry and land, like plants release, take CO2 and all that. And then there is a set of gases. We call them as greenhouse gas emissions. And that greenhouse gas emissions comprises of four different type of gases, which is CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and ferrous gases. And what we're going to talk about here is the carbon emissions, which is CO2 emissions, which is mostly by fossil fuel and industrial process. And that's a big chunk of CO2 emissions into the planet. And that also is the biggest contributor for the greenhouse gas emissions. So our topic tonight, this presentation for the next 30 minutes will revolve around the CO2 emissions from industrial waste and fossil fuels, and how do we need to act on it, and how does companies need to work on it, and how do we make it better. So that takes me to my next slide, which is what is carbon emissions and how does that equate to supply chain, and how does it work? Essentially, there are three different scopes in carbon emissions. Emissions which are very direct, so the smoke or the CO2 that's released from factories and by company vehicles or chemical production, which are directly related to a factory. As an example, Lamazoko, we make machines in a factory. So these are all the emissions directly related to factory, and that's part of scope number one, which is called direct emissions. Scope number two, indirect, which is essentially any electricity that is used in making the machines or the staff using computers, the lights to run the factory and everything. So anything which is indirectly consumed to make a product, it's called indirect electricity emissions, and that's scope number two. Scope number three is value chain emissions, which is essentially the goods that are purchased. So to make coffee machines, as an example, we need stainless steel. So if the company Lamazoko is buying raw material stainless steel from any of their suppliers, the emissions released through that process of buying that steel is scope number three, which is a value chain emissions. So it's transportation involved in getting those raw materials to the factory. It's the employee commute, the business travels, and all that comes to scope three. So I'll just reiterate, there's three scopes: direct, indirect, and value chain emissions. Just to make it a little bit simpler, I'll break these three scopes down into our day-to-day life. Number one, I'm not sure how many of you drive a car or any sort of motorcycle. If you're using petrol or diesel, and if you're emitting gases, which is obviously through your combustion pipe, that is scope number one. So because you or myself driving the diesel car are directly emitting CO2 through my car. So that's number one, which is direct. I'm fully responsible for that. Number two, I'm sure everyone has a laptop or phone or anything. So we all plug it in, we all charge our phones and all that. So the emissions that is released by the electricity provider where you source your electricity from, that is indirect. So you're not directly releasing any CO2 emissions by charging your phone, but the company you get your electricity from is releasing an amount of CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's another basic example to a day-to-day life. And number three, it could be anything you all buy from online shopping. When you buy something online, it comes to your door. To get to your door, that parcel would have been on a truck, it'd been on a little van, or whatever it needs to happen to get to your door. There's a lot of emissions throughout that supply chain process, and that's value chain emissions. That's scope number three. So I hope that is clear. I've tried to break it down to a very simple language. So if any questions, again, like I said, please unmute and ask the question. This is the sort of framework La Marzocco work towards, and it's a UN Sustainability Development Goals. And obviously you can see there are 17 big milestones to tackle throughout this framework, starting with no poverty, zero hunger, and all the rest, as you can see from here. I'm not going to talk about each and every single thing because obviously there's quite a lot in here, and we're going to talk more about the climate action in particular more here, and also a few other industry and innovation stuff, and also clean energy. So I'll focus on only a couple of things here, not all of it, because there's quite a lot to cover. You probably noticed from the factory video when we played the initial video, La Marzocco factory is completely solar powered, and 80% of factory electrical needs are generated through solar energy. And the entire program is monitored by a program called Energy Brain. So when people walk into the factory, there's a big dashboard where it will tell how much energy is used and how much energy is generated through the solar panels. So, which is a great thing. So in terms of scope one, factory has a very little carbon emissions because, scope two, because all the energy used in making machines, all the electricity and everything, it's all directly coming through solar power. So, which is an awesome thing. And distilled machine to recuperate water. Obviously, to make coffee machines and to test the coffee machines, there's a lot of water being used, and it's obviously it's a lot of fresh water. But factory has a distilling water machine, which is essentially used to ensure that we're not wasting a lot of water through this entire process. And the final thing is CFP, it's carbon footprint program. The project was started early 20 on a mission to reduce carbon footprint globally. So we started the program early 2020, and we are working towards a mission to reduce the carbon footprint, which is again CO2 emissions, as much as possible globally. So that's the three main things in terms of care for the planet and what are we doing as a company in tackling this essentially in lifetime forward. In also saying that all our machines come with fully equipped with insulated boilers and energy efficiency capacitors. So when you're not using the machine turns off on its own, so it goes to a standby mode. That's another very small example what the company does in terms of a lot of other things to reduce the amount of electricity that is consumed to maintain these machines. There is a lot of sophisticated software as well in the machines that allows to control the water temperature inside the machine. And again, if you need to consistently and constantly keep boiling the water, there's a lot of energy is drawn. To reduce the amount of electricity that is used, the machines do have a sophisticated software, and it started using new technology as well, which in turn saves a lot of energy, not just to us, to our end consumers as well. When they use the machines are a lot of energy efficient as well. So that's part of that's a few little initiatives. There's a lot more happening, but I just thought I'll highlight very big ones. I'll take you to my next slide. Which this essentially is a carbon emission summary on how we are performing as a factory business on 3 different scopes. Like I mentioned before, there are direct emissions, indirect emissions, and there's value chain. And one of the bigger things in any industry, if you want to manage or if you want to make anything better, you need to measure it first. So you measure first to manage or make things better. If you don't measure, if you don't track your KPIs, or if you don't track anything, you're never going to get a good outcome. A very simple example, if someone's trying to lose weight, you really need to know how much you weigh. So you don't track yourself. It's hard to measure if you're making progress in life. So as a starting point, Lamazoko worked on measuring how much carbon emissions we are contributing to the atmosphere. And we engaged with a company called Reta Climate, where they have broken down all the stuff we do at the factory into 3 different scopes, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, which in turn gave us a measurement on how we can effectively work towards on reducing, and which areas do we need to focus, which areas we are doing really well, and what else can we do to make it more zero carbon. Essentially, again, the word zero carbon is how do we reduce the carbon emissions in any of the complete supply chain? Well, number 1, number 2, and number 3. So regardless of what scope, the goal is to reduce as much as possible. Also, given it's a big factory and there's a lot of things happening, one of the big other things as well in terms of the whole zero carbon sustainability program, not just for Lamazoko, any other company you come across, the first thing you do is you try to reduce it. If you can't reduce it, you offset some of that in other different ways. As an example, Microsoft started their own carbon offset program, where if you can't reduce your carbon footprint, you do something to offset that. As an example, some transport companies, they plant trees to counterbalance the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere. So Microsoft has a lot of programs they're working on to offset the amount of carbon emissions. Whatever they can't reduce, in turn gets offset to a different program. So Lamazoko as well, taking the same path, is reduce where possible. If you can't reduce it, take offset program, and every department in the company has a budget on how much we need to offset and how much we need to reduce. And again, this is going to be continuously evolving over time, and we will be looking forward to make more improvements and make more suggestions over time and get to a zero carbon state over time eventually. So that's the goal. I'll go to the next slide. So we're coming down to Australian carbon emissions and what else we can do. So as a supply chain manager, I'm very much aware that getting goods from overseas, Australia is 95%, probably even more, is relying on factories overseas. Literally nothing is produced here. Very little part of our day-to-day life products are produced in Australia. Majority of them are imported from overseas. There's a little indication here, as you can see. If you're importing 10,000 kilos through a sea freight container, through a vessel, it will emit 1,260 kilos of carbon emissions. If you air freight 100 kilos, it will emit similar amount of CO2. So as you can see, that's a significant amount of variance between air and sea freight. So air freight is the biggest killer for carbon emissions. So the goal for me when I joined the business is to reduce the amount of air freight we use to import goods from Italy, Germany, wherever the machines are coming from, and then move everything to a sea freight, which is a good thing for the business, because obviously air freights cost more for the business to import. And also it's very bad for the planet. So one of my tasks when I joined the business, I've made a conscious decision to measure how much of the product we import via sea and air. And I consciously made a lot of efforts to move everything to sea and then reduce the number of air freights. And it's a long-term task. It will take time, but how do you do that is better planning, better forecasting, and better purchasing choices. Once we do all these 3 in sync together, it will give you a better idea of what product you need so you can plan better. Since air freight might take 7 days to get a machine from Italy to Melbourne, versus a sea freight will take you 35 to 45 days. So obviously there is a bit of a time you're losing getting machines by sea freight, but there's a lot of benefits. So that's where the planning and forecasting and procurement comes in place. A few other things we did in Australia as a local company is divert local waste to local companies who are doing alternate measures. So as an example, when you make coffee, there is a bit of coffee waste that comes out of a coffee once it's done. Rather than throwing it in a landfill, we redirect to community gardens, and coffee waste is really rich to produce plants. So we actively participate with local communities here and redirect all the coffee waste. So it is used in the community gardens to grow plants. It is used as a fertilizer. So there's a lot of benefits as well. In terms of purchased goods and services, again, supply chain is a very big space to reduce carbon emissions. Considering it's a big business, it's a big division in any business where the work of moving goods and transporting goods happens. So there is a lot of scope. If you look at every other department versus supply chain, there is a lot of ownership. At the same time, there is a lot of scope to improve CO2 emissions within supply chain. So that's another fun part of my job, is because I have so many controls, there's so much scope to improve things. We can do quite a lot of great things for not just for the company, it's better for the planet. So yeah, so purchase goods, employee commute. Pre-pandemic, the company was already working from home, had an option to work from home. Again, it was a very good option, so we can reduce the CO2 emissions, me traveling to work every day in the car versus working from home 2 or 3 days a week. So any employee can work from home pre-pandemic. The company was already allowed to do that, which obviously now it's forced to do anyway, so it's worked really well. Business travel, we evaluate quite a lot pre-pandemic on making business travels. Given air freight, again, like I mentioned before, planes and aviation industry is one of the biggest contributor to increasing the carbon emissions. So again, it's a very important decision the business have to make when you do a travels. The use of waste products and company waste disposal, pretty similar to the coffee waste. We have a lot of soft plastic and a lot of cardboard. There's a lot of company waste. It will come out of your supply chain, and it's important to focus and make sure it is getting to the right landfill, and which will eventually reduce your carbon footprint overall. No questions, I'll continue. I can probably answer all your questions if there are in the chat box as well. So next,
Rakesh,
what else?
Sorry, Rakesh, sorry. There's a question on the chat box.
Okay.
Do you want to answer it after your presentation, or would you prefer to answer it right away? What would you prefer?
Okay, maybe I'll answer. If it's in a chat box, I'll answer. I've got 2 more slides to finish, and then I'll answer all together. Thanks, Max.
Yep, sure.
Cool. Going about what else can we do? What is Lamazaka doing it further? We are working on innovating to different ways to reduce carbon footprint by working on sourcing different components to reduce footprint, reducing the carbon footprint of the transport costs we incur, creating more energy efficient equipment, again, through using a lot of sophisticated software, a lot of insulation, and a lot of new technology. We are making sure that we have more energy efficient equipment, and also we now have a lot of equipments equipped with IoT, where you can enable and disable your machines through a phone, and also it monitors your electricity consumption as well. So there's a lot of innovative stuff coming out of the carbon emission, reducing carbon footprint. And we are investing in reducing and offsetting carbon footprint. Like I mentioned before, either we reduce or we offset. We are working with a lot of sustainability initiatives for staff, suppliers, and customers. Again, we work with a lot of roasting customers. We work with a lot of cafes, and we do engage them in a lot of different ways to help and also take help from us in reducing the carbon footprint. And we are working with a lot of industry adoption agencies to set up best sustainable practices, reporting benchmarks, and set a standard for the industry. So that's point number 2 about what is Lama Soko doing and what else can we do. And the last point is about value creation metrics and regeneration economy. So this is an interesting table, and I really found it interesting when I came across a book called Do and Build Beautiful Businesses. And one of the interesting takeaways for me from reading that book was around a lot of companies today work towards extraction economy. As an example, you can see here from a main stakeholder metrics, society as your main stakeholder, not shareholders. Work reconnects the society itself. A lot of companies' engagement right now in an extraction model is all about the shareholder interest, very much less about the society impact. But I think it's over time, over generations, things are changing, and I'm confident and optimistic things will start moving towards regeneration economy. It's not about command and control leadership anymore. It's all about inspiring and motivating future leaders. And that's what regeneration economy is all about. Without inspiring and motivating new future leaders into the business, we cannot think about making businesses beautiful and better for the planet. So there's a lot of takeaways from what we learned so far from extraction economy in the last 3 or 4 decades of industrialization, where it's always been about financial impact. It's always been about more takings, less contributions. It's been more of command and control and very structured hierarchy takeaway, versus we are moving into a regeneration economy where we are talking about society impact, social interest, communities, inspiration, motivating new future leaders coming into the industry. And we're talking more about organization culture rather than a typical hierarchy structure where we sit in. And as you can see, there's a lot of companies, like I mentioned before, Microsoft, and even Lama Soko is a great example, where we are moving towards regeneration economy. And I'm very happy that I'm working here where we're working towards regeneration. And again, it's not going to be a short term, it's a long-term impact. And hopefully a lot of businesses see the value in regeneration and move towards this economy. So that's my last point, number 3. So we spoke about 3 points, just a quick recap. We talk about carbon emissions and what is the importance of CO2 and its emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And the number 2 is Lama Soko's parts of decarbonization. And the number 3 was value creation metrics and of regeneration economy. So that's 3 points. And lastly, I just want to leave everyone with a message before we get into Q&A, is I'm sure we've seen this message quite a lot: stop killing our planet. And reading one of another books from Dr. James Carse, which is about infinite and finite planet. And that message really struck my mind, where the planet itself, it's not going to die because planet is an infinite thing. The species which we are finite. So essentially, by doing what we're doing now without caring too much about the planet and burning and all the CO2 emissions, essentially we are actually in the process to stop killing ourselves, not the planet. So in the process to eradicate the carbon problem, we need to all approach with a hunting mindset, where we need to approach it with a farming mindset, where it's going to take a lot of time for the next 10 years or 15 years for all of us to work together and think about every single thing in whatever we all do, from a professional life and a personal life. As simple as, do you really need to drink water out of a plastic bottle? Or can you find another alternate? Or if you do take a plastic bottle, are you responsibly recycling it properly? Or is it going straight into, you don't know where it's going to? Or even fast fashion. If you talk about supply chain in fast fashion, we buy something and then we change it in 30 days. And is that really important for us? We really need to evaluate all that and make sure that we are behaving responsibly to the planet, because there's a lot of damage already done. and we really need to be very mindful about how we can manage our future. And we all seen COVID. COVID is a very mild version of what can happen if we don't act now. So there's more to come. So I think it's better for all of us to act now. So that's my final message on this carbon emissions. And yeah, thank you. I think I'm just up for my time.